Key thing is I'm Caleb Jackson, Head of Change for Youth Sector at the Youth Endowment Fund. The Youth Endowment Fund is a make it work centre. That's how we like to describe ourselves, with less than £200 million to find out what works to reduce young people from becoming involved in violence. And if this is your first time, you are very welcome as well. We have a focus here today on the youth sector, and particularly how youth work is able to reach children from Black, Asian, and minority ethnic backgrounds as a key focal point of today's discussion. We have a commitment towards race equity, and so this is what we would name as a very focused topic in the youth sector linked to race equity. We take our race equity goals and commitment very serious, and you can hear much more about and read much more about that in our recent report. And that report is annual, and that will go towards our senior governance groups as accountability in terms of what we're doing to fulfill our ambitions here. So, but it's without saying that the sector has recently had unwanted engagement during online events, especially those of this sort of nature. So we're hopeful that we don't get any interruptions today, and we've taken precautions to tighten our webinar security in that regard. So we will have a great event. We have some great speakers lined up, and looking forward to everything they have to say. And we've taken every step that is feasible in order to ensure that this goes ahead uninterrupted. And so with that said, if all of that hard work fails, we will bring the webinar to immediate close and then email colleagues after to reinstate another of the same event later on, but we should be fine. So we're excited to share this event, and we'll be exploring the crucial role that youth work plays in reaching and supporting children from Black, Asian, and minority ethnic backgrounds, with a special focus on its role in preventing violence. And we have some fantastic speakers who are going to share their worldview on how they're tackling some of this and some of the challenges, bumps in the road, and some of the solutions. I think it's important that we speak out loud and have an honest conversation about. Equally, this session is typically aimed at commissioners, funders, practitioners. There will be some researchers who are interested in this. There will be some youth sector leaders here to hear about some of these valuable insights and practical approaches. The course of the session is that you'll hear from our colleagues who have joined us today, who are in it right now. And I think that's important, very much in the precipice of what's happening today. I think that's important. Then also you'll hear from Chloe, who's a colleague at YEF, and I'll tell you more about that. Then we'll finish with some Q&A. Please use the chat function, or certainly send your question through, and we'll make sure that speakers get ample time to speak about that. But do stick around for the end of the session, where I will be sharing some updates with you about YEF, and the key parts there is what's happening around YEF that it's worth you knowing about to take back to colleagues and back to your organization. So with that said, I wanted to kick us off with Adam from Audio Active. Adam Julia is the CEO at Audio Active, which is a groundbreaking music organization working with young people and emerging artists along the South Coast. I've visited it myself and heard from performances myself, and we were just talking in the green room about how impactful and powerful those performances were in person. And it's helped to nurture talents such as artists including Rag and Bone Man, Celeste, Rizzle Kicks, and RD. So if you're down with the kids, you will know exactly what's going on there. And maybe you can drop Adam a line and maybe get a green room experience going on there. But Adam cut his teeth in Nottingham, working in alternative education, youth work, music projects during the emergence of UK grime scene, which will be the late 2000s, early to mid 2000s, if I have it rightly, Adam. You'll have to tell me. And you know, gun and gang violence were rife in the city and the communities, and to achieve impact in such a challenging context, Adam pioneered creative, often unconventional approaches to reach and engage young people. So he moved to Brighton in 2006 and took over Audio Active in its infancy as a staff member, and is now a CEO with regular paid work for nearly 50 artists and practitioners, mentors, creatives, and staff. Definitely scaled up. And he's also the founding director of Platform B Radio, is an advisor to Cultural Learning Alliance and the PRS Foundation. He was recently once one of only 7 people in the UK awarded the Game Changer status by National Lottery for his innovative work within the art. So, Adam, the floor is yours for the next 15 minutes.
Thank you, Caleb, and thanks for having me here today, and to the rest of your YEF colleagues. Really excited to be with you all. So I'm Adam, and as Caleb said, I work at Audioactive. And just to tell you a little bit about Audioactive before we get sort of into some of the detail and the context of the day, we essentially are a music organisation, and we have a whole heap of projects which are all free for young people and young adults to attend. But I think they sort of fit roughly within kind of 3 different work streams. We've got projects which use music for social change and have first and foremost a social outcome before the music progression development side of stuff. And we have a raft of projects which we call our grassroots talents development, which is just sort of no agenda, open access, music for music's sake, sort of skills and facilities and access to expertise and development opportunities. And then we have another work stream which is more about routes into industry and for young people who want to carve out a career either as artists or in jobs in creative industries around the artists. And those 3 kind of things really come together and overlap really nicely into quite an accessible pipeline where we see a lot of young people who tend to fall through the cracks of conventional approaches, formal education, really seem to thrive. I mentioned that we have a social change group of projects. One of those projects is called Shift, and it's a one-to-one mentoring program which grew out of a public health contract in Brighton and Hove. And it was initially set up to identify young people who were exhibiting quite risky behaviours, maybe on the peripheries of drug supply, maybe high risk of unwanted pregnancy. They're quite public health outcomes, I guess. And that started in 2018, which is around the time that the violence reduction partnerships and violence reduction units were also getting off the ground. And in the same year, we were approached by Violence Reduction Partnership in Sussex and asked if we could tweak the Shift intervention specifically around working one-to-one with young people who are at risk of criminal exploitation and serious youth violence. So we developed the Shift intervention over the following 4 or 5 years, and in May 2024, we started working with the Youth Endowment Fund towards a full efficacy study on Shift, specifically the one-to-one mentoring part of it, which operates on a trusted adult kind of model. And we're currently coming towards the end of our first pilot to see if we can carry on to the full efficacy phase. Everything's going really well. So we've got some, over the last 6 years of Shift, we've got some really nice insight around some of the questions that frame today's piece. And I'm just here to talk to you for the next 10 minutes or so with just some insights really around what we've found works and maybe some questions and provocations which really hope will lead into some good conversations with you all during the Q&A afterwards. So in terms of understanding engagement and what strategies have been really good at engaging young people from Black, Asian, ethnic minority backgrounds, I think the first thing that I'd like to say is that where I've noticed it really working tends to be in the DNA and just the normal behaviours of organisations, as opposed to something that was really strategized and chin rubbed over. I think that it wasn't until we were doing this quite well that we realised we were doing it quite well. And what I mean by that, to give an example, is that I think that let me give you a real life example. When 2020 happened and all of the stuff that happened after George Floyd's killing, there was a big sort of movement towards what people are going to do, make commitments towards anti-racism and how they would hold themselves to account to those plans and those commitments. And I looked at a lot of the other organisations locally mainly who were coming up with really amazing statements and commitments. And I looked at them, to be honest, with envy, because I thought, God, I wish we could come up with something that rigorous and that good. And felt like that we weren't, because we didn't position ourselves as an organisation that was only for Black or brown young people, or that were experts in anti-racism, I felt like we were a little bit behind in terms of some of that thinking of how to come up with a statement and a commitment like that, until someone turned around to me and said, look, a lot of people in the city or in the area are looking to Audioactive for some leadership here. What are you going to say? And it kind of made me realise that actually, I think because we were fairly inclusive already and performing fairly well against our local, Sussex is a very white area generally. It's not something that we ever thought we needed to sit down and really think about. It was just something we were doing. And I think that, so the first of my things in terms of saying what works and understanding engagement, I don't think it's any coincidence that we're predominantly a Black music organisation, that we are accessible to a broad diversity of ethnicities. So I think my first sort of observation is do something that's culturally relevant, but do it in a really authentic way. We're a Black music organisation doing Black music, and that might sound obvious, but I think that sometimes it's as simple as that, and making sure the activity that you run isn't only just relevant to who you're trying to engage, but it is really authentic. It's artist-led. It's kind of, it's not necessarily something that was set up predominantly with the intent of inclusion and engagement specific communities. So I think what I'm trying to say there is the reason why it works well for us is incidental as opposed to conscious decision or strategized, let's say. I think the second one really is something which was a bit more of a strategy, albeit not starting off as a strategy to engage with more minoritized young people. And that was a strategy to make sure that our workforce doesn't become old and irrelevant to young people. And I think around 2010, a colleague of mine, we were doing a lot of work with youth offending teams at the time, but a colleague of mine said, if we're not careful, we're going to be a bunch of 50-year-old men and women trying to be down with the kids and trying to come across as though we really know what we're talking about. And that's probably not going to be ideal, given that we're a young Black music organisation. So let's start now with try a 10-year bet, really, on what our workforce is going to look like in 10 years. And we started running a young leadership programme just with 3 or 4 young adults at a time, so that they had a realistic chance of coming out of that programme and straight into employment with us or with someone else doing similar work. And it worked, really. We've been running that programme pretty much once a year for the last 12 or 14 years. I've lost count, sorry, I don't know. But out of about, if you include our employed mentors, out of about 40 practitioners and workshop leaders, over half of those have come up through our young leaders training during that period. And in terms of the recruitment for those courses and for that programme, we've drawn from the artist community. And when there's been a sort of an 18 to 25-year-old emerging artist who is being seen as a figurehead in their musical circles, but we can also see some real promise in terms of their personal and social skills and some potential there in becoming leaders and workshop facilitators, that's how we draw and recruit for that programme. We also prioritise it for people who have less prospects as a result of lower formal qualifications. And again, I think because we're drawing from the musical footprint, being the black music, there's been a really sort of, I think, an over 50% representation of Black and brown young adults coming into that programme. So 10 or 12 years later, our frontline practitioner workforce looks very diverse, and that in itself is probably our strongest, I say strategy, it wasn't a diversity strategy, it was more of an age one, but has resulted in us being very culturally relevant when we're going out and asking young people to engage in what we do. So I guess that's my first insight there. I think, though, what I've found really challenging is when we're recruiting for management roles and the sort of the core team. And it would be easy to assume that because we're a diverse-led organisation, we're working within diverse musical footprint, that actually it would be easy to mirror this representation on the core team side, but it hasn't been at all. It's been a real challenge getting even a diverse long list, let alone a diverse short list together when we recruit management roles. So I think that I'll talk a little bit about that later on in terms of some ideas of what might need to change, what commissioners and funders and policymakers' roles in addressing some of these issues might be. How am I doing for time? Caleb, another 5 minutes?
Yeah, another 5.
And on that note, then, I think sort of skipping forward to the role of funding and policy, and having a think about what role should funders and commissioners prioritise to ensure that the resources are used effectively in addressing violence amongst these groups. I think that, well, actually, first and foremost, and it's quite a quick one to get out of the way, because I'm not going to go deep into it, one of the key policies, not knowing exactly who we've got in the room, that I saw make a real difference during this journey, and I've been working at Audioactive for nearly 19 years now, was the decision, I guess you could call it, for the police and the law to start treating young people as victims who were tied up in exploitation and quite often drug supply. I guess with the change of administration, the focus on youth violence becoming more and more prominent in the media and in politics, from a policy perspective, that would be the one policy which I would urge people to protect. Because I feel that when, and it seemed to take a long while in practice for police for us to notice how this was children being treated differently in these situations. It does seem to have got somewhere now. And I guess with so much change in the world, I would worry about that policy being changed. But I'm not going to go too deep into that one. I think something that I would like to go a bit deeper into is, from a funder's perspective, is acknowledging that even for a diverse-led organisation who performs fairly well on representation at the moment, that even for organisations like us, it can be a real challenge, as I said, building your workforce to be representative of the communities that you want to engage. And for us, that's the key thing. And if we struggle, you've got to assume that the vast majority of the wider sector, much of which isn't diverse-led, is going to probably struggle even more. You're always going to get sort of patches, I think, geographically, where there's a much more diverse representation, and it might be a bit easier there. But I think that if funders and commissioners could recognise quite how challenging it can be for organisations to build diverse teams and therefore be better at engaging young people from certain communities, that we need a bit of extra help. It takes extra resource. Most of the organisations, I imagine, who this might be relevant to, a lot of them are going to be smaller than the organisation that I run. They're going to have less HR expertise, less resource to find talent and acquire talent. And these are the things that I think funders can really help out with by recognising the challenge that the sector has, and almost maybe not requiring, but asking the question about whether organisations need additional support, funding and expertise in order to diversify their workforce. Because my bet would be that most of them would bite your hand off for that support. I have seen this kind of support being offered through Youth Endowment Fund, having come through the grant-making process now. And I think that's a real good look, actually, for YEF to identify that especially diverse-led organisations sometimes need this kind of support. And I also think, sort of in the same vein, there was one, just to close, I was asked to maybe make a suggestion of what would make a difference, what needs to change to support some of these outcomes. And my observation is that although I think we're still at a point out there, and it's very sad to see some major organisations draw back from DE&I commitments more of which we've seen today in America. But I think we're still in a situation where Black and brown professionals and potential leaders have got no less talent or potential than their counterparts. However, we've had much less practice at the senior stuff, at the leadership, at the governance. And these are the kind of things that in an organization can unlock growth, or that can really hold you down if you're not on top of them. But we rarely get a chance to develop those skills, given that there's been such a rich heritage of non-Black and brown professionals developing these skills over decades and hundreds of years. So in terms of one thing that I thought might be able to change is whether there were sort of specific initiatives that funders can offer to really develop future leaders, and sometimes the boring stuff like the governance stuff, the all of that side of things. Me personally, in my journey, I've benefited from mentoring. Without mentoring from 2 or 3 key people over that 19 years, I would never have developed to this point. And I think Audioactive in turn wouldn't be able to be delivering on the scale we are at now. I think that's probably quite a good place to leave it.
Thanks so much, Adam. So much said there, from understanding your DNA and where you're starting out, being really cool. You know, the music industry has a natural draw towards children from Black, Asian, and minority ethnic backgrounds, incidental rather than a strategic approach to it. But recognition that actually more support is needed to see colleagues in more senior roles leading from the front, that would then cascade down and improve engagement, because you've got people that get it and understand it better. So thanks so much for that, and really appreciate that, Adam. So next we'll be hearing from Des Brown. Des is the founder and CEO of Spark to Life, an award-winning faith-based, not faith-biased charity working with medium to high-risk young people and adults. Des has been through the criminal justice system, and at 17 he was in prison for manslaughter, culminating in him finding faith and becoming an ordained minister. Des has written an autobiography, Convicted or Condemned, and he is a qualified therapist. He trains professionals on trauma awareness and has served as a prison therapist and a sessional prison chaplain. Des, great to have you. The floor is yours. We'd love to hear from you.
Excellent. And it's great to be here. Hi to everyone. And thank you for the nice introduction. Very good. So just a quick overview of Spark to Life. Started 2006 from a police officer, an inspector, actually hearing about my own story and the work that I was doing just generically with young people at that time in East London. And just really wanted me to share my own journey and lived experience, stroke consequences that, you know, kind of decisions can make, especially a kind of decision around violence, etc., how it impacts family, community. And so that's really how Spark to Life started, from just me as a personality and as an individual. But I think as a lot of grassroots Black-led organizations can often start from strong personalities within a community wanting to make something different and to do something different. And if you're not careful, often it's based on a personality and it doesn't evolve into a program or a methodology or into a theory of change. And I'm using these words that many of us on the teams will be familiar with, but it's important for us to understand that not every organization that is Black-led in the regions that we work in necessarily have that understanding of language. And I think it's quite important, because when we're looking at issues around serious youth violence specifically, and violence affecting young people, we've got to ask ourselves where there's areas of disproportionality or where there's areas of overrepresentation, who are the people in the room making the decisions and steering the ship, for want of a better term. And if there's few people of that demographic within the room steering the ship, having a voice, we've got to ask ourselves why. Is it because they're not out there? Or I think similar to Adam's point that he mentioned there at the end, you know, how many years behind, or, you know, what are the lack of opportunities, for want of a better term, that have been given to specific people groups to be able to grow, scale and develop their charities, their CICs, their organizations. So I think that's how I kind of started. I think, I would say in our organization, just that's quite important, all our trustees are African Caribbean heritage. All of our workers, out of 34 full-time workers, apart from 3, are from African Caribbean heritage again and Asian heritage. And I think that's quite important because if we say that we are a Black-led organisation and we work within this space, not to say we wouldn't work with people from other demographics or other communities, but because we're in London and that's mostly where our footprint is, unfortunately, as I'm sure we're all aware of statistics, there is an overrepresentation of whether it be stop and search, school exclusions, prison incarceration, and also mental health. And these are the kind of 4 areas that we would at some way segue into in the work that we do with young people aged between 11 being the very youngest, but up to say 30. So when we're talking about young people or young adults, from my perspective, as I'm talking here today, I'm going up to say 30, but primarily 15 years old to say 25. When we talk about people's emotional intelligence, especially for, males, for argument's sake, not necessarily developing until that age. And when we start looking at perpetrators or offending history, I think that's quite important for us to appreciate and understand if we're looking to bring about change. So looking more specifically, I suppose, at, and just out of that, 31 of that 50% of our workforce have lived experience, which means they've either been in prison, which is a large number, obviously reformed, transformed offenders, and or they have partners or siblings that have been in prison, which I think, again, is quite helpful when we're looking at serious youth violence. I would say we kind of pride ourselves and work with more medium to high risk. And I think, again, each organization will have its area, and in a landscape that can be quite dense and quite populated when we talk about youth work generically, I think it's quite important to try and distinguish, well, which organization is doing what where and where are people's specialisms. So I would say Spark to Life specialism is we are a Black-led organization. We do advocate and we primarily work with medium to high risk offenders. And every local authority will have for want of a better term, a kind of a risk/need register of how do they determine who gets a service and not. And when we talk about serious youth violence, and I know that's one of the key things that Youth Endowment Fund have been set up to address, I think it's fair to say we're not talking about the majority of young people caught up in this. We are talking about the majority of young people being impacted by this in some way or form, or whether that's, kind of permissive trauma, secondary trauma, or primary trauma, which is it's they themselves involved, etc., which is where we would sit. We would sit with those that are actively involved and quite complex in what's going on in their world. So when we're looking at strategies to effectively engage, I think when we're working with young people from that demographic, I think professional curiosity is really important. As we know, there's no 2 young person the same. Everyone, will come with their own lived experience, their own journey, and we talk a lot about ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. I was in prison when I was 17, 18, 19. I'm now kind of 50 years old. I know some of you will say, oh, you don't look that old. Thank you very much for that. But on a serious note, and so my lived experience way back then, when they had slop out in prison, in Brixton prison, is completely different now to a young person who's either in Cookenwood, in Feltham, in Pentonville, etc. And what they're having to navigate now with social media, I didn't have to navigate then. And so this professional curiosity is really important. And that's not necessarily around the work or the ethnicity of the worker. It's about the worker saying, do you know what? I need to learn and understand what this person's journey is like. Because more often than not, especially if we're working from a statutory point and we have to manage risk when we're dealing with serious youth violence or violence affecting young people, more often than not, we're making decisions around risk. We're not making decisions around the person. So it's less person-centered, it's more risk-averse. And I think being a charity, and if you are of that representation here in this call, it's quite important to understand. And if you're not and you're given funding, I think it's also quite important and worth understanding that actually who holds the power. Because a young person will often work with you, not only because of trust, but their first thinking is, well, where does the power lie here? If I'm a statutory service and I manage risk and I can breach you or I can, recall you, and that's the power that I have, then how much trust can really be brought? Whereas when you're a third sector and you don't have to carry that level of, not that you don't manage risk, you manage risk accordingly, but that's not, you don't hold the power to that. I think you can build a more authentic relationship. I think it's also important to understand that if you are a charity, you have a lot more flexibility. You can be innovative about your approach and how you approach. So we don't see young people that we work with, which is more kind of our core business. So we'll work with, say, 250 one-to-one every week, young people that would be caught up in serious youth activity in London specifically. So we work probably across about 8 or 9 boroughs. And for that reason, we don't see them in youth offender team or in probation. We see them outside. The first meeting, yes, we would. And I think, again, these are some of the strategies. Because how are they going to see us, and how are they going to see you if you're engaging them and working with them? And I think when we're talking about overrepresentation in these different areas, young people, young adults, they're fully aware of what the narrative is in the media. They're fully aware of what the narrative is from statutory services. And more often than not, they will carry a narrative. And it's being able to be honest with that, be open about that, but also have that, what I would call, courageous conversation. It's easier if I, as a black person, talk about issues of racism with a young person that I'm working with that looks like me. And can somebody who, for instance, is white, can they have those conversations if that's what the young person is grappling with, whether it be issues of unfairness, stop and search, ill treatment, etc., etc. And I think it's true to say, even if somebody's done wrong, I think from a professional point of view, we want to advocate that they're treated fairly. We're not here to say, okay, more often than not, we know if somebody's done something wrong. But the truth is, are they going to be treated fairly by the system? And I think when we engage, one of the strategies we use is we are here to advocate for you. What does that look like for them? So we're there to bring your voice into the spaces where discussions are being made about you, but you're not there. So I may not necessarily agree with some of the things they're saying, but it's their voice. So it's down for my professionalism. How do I couch that in a way that's constructive and not destructive? How can I put that across so it actually helps the young person, but it puts it in a language that the system can understand? And so when you start looking at somebody who, for instance, is, involved in criminal activity, the language we may use is Maslow's hierarchy of needs, because the system understands that. Now, I can't just turn and say, well, look, they're involved in criminal activity because they're lacking various different, needs in their world, for argument's sake, whether it be food, whether it be a safe space. So home is a home, but it's not necessarily a safe space for whatever reason. And so but once you speak to professionals about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, they begin to realize and understand that if someone's basic needs aren't being met, it can create a person to present a level of dysfunctionality. It doesn't condone it, but what it does show is actually there's a reason why this child or this young person or this young adult is acting like this. Just another thing before I move on, traumatic bonding, I think, is a massive thing within the sector we don't talk about. We talk about it when we look at domestic violence and we look at that perpetrator and victim, oppressive abuse, control, etc. And if somebody was to present themselves being, controlled, manipulated, or abused through domestic violence, but yet that person going through it will still see the perpetrator as a friend or somebody that actually they feel safer with, because it's better to make a friend of your enemy than to make an enemy of your enemy. A lot of young people are going through what we would call traumatic bonding. They've bonded to the perpetrator or to that lifestyle because they have to survive. And if you was to take them back, it's a constrained choice that they've been brought into. And I think all of this creates a language and a narrative to be able to constructively become a critical friend to the system, but to advocate for the young person. I think some of the barriers or challenges around funding specifically, I do feel that the landscape I would call it racial appropriation. That's my term. So racial appropriation is when a person who isn't of a specific demographic uses what is of that culture to enhance or leverage for personal gain. And I do feel within the funding landscape that happened after George Floyd's. There's a lot of organizations that weren't working specifically with that demographic that began to then design and develop programs for that demographic, but yet the senior leadership did not represent that demographic. Therefore, the decisions that are being made by it or by that organization wasn't reflective. And I think that would, for me, would be kind of in the funding scheme, racial appropriation. And I think there's a lot of small organizations out there, and this is kind of skipping onto the role of funding, and I'll kind of interchange between the two, where I think there can be a lot of generous leadership from larger organizations. You know, when you think about the criminal justice system as a whole, having worked within CLINC's, you know, third sector advisory board, and having conversations around in the previous tranche and even this tranche of funding that's gone out, how many Black-led organizations got funded that work with this demographic? There was no organization that turned over more than $1 million that they could name, and no organization that got funded as a prime or even as a second tier funder to work with that demographic. And so what happens is when management costs come off, if then the push is to work with Black-led organizations as part of the criteria, I think it's really important that management costs should be put in that. Otherwise, that organization never grows its management capacity to do for self. And so you'll hear the narrative within the Black community when it's looking at its community is actually, we can't work with the systems if we don't feel the systems are fair, and they begin to have a narrative which is do for self. We have to work for our own communities in our own way because we're not being brought to the table to be supported. Now, you can do with that as you will. I'm not saying there's a right or wrong in that. I'm just telling you, based on my connections and my relationships, is more often than not the language that's going out there. I think we're all aware there are some great organizations that are grassroots that may be built on personalities that need to develop into programs. But the truth is, how do they scale? How do they grow? A lot of it is around infrastructure. You know, and contracts can give you that a little bit, grants less so. And so I think it's about, when we look at the funding landscape, when we look at it regionally across the country, I'm not talking about what I would call, for want of a better term, kind of positive discrimination. I'm talking about positive action. What can the powers that be that have funding to think, okay, how can we act positively to develop and support regionally now? Because it's not just London, obviously, I'm talking about, it's across the country where there are a deficit of Black-led organizations, but the ones that are there, can we help build their infrastructure? What would that look like intentionally to show some kind of good practice, to show this is how you can grow from, I don't know, 100,000 to 500,000 to maybe 1 million? Because the truth is, we need those organizations if we're going to be able to be best placed to work with those specific demographics. And if not, what happens is you'll find that organizations will develop a program. I think Adam, you know, eloquently put it at the beginning when he talked about the evolving of his organization. How authentic is it? Is it something that actually we have done to create a service in an area so we can get funding? Or is it part of our DNA? Is it who we are? Is it who we represent? And, you know, there's this saying, isn't it? People will catch who you are, not what you say. And when you work with young people that are hustlers, they're actually very good at picking up quite quickly whether someone's authentic or not. And they will use you for what they want. But the bottom line is they'll be around a long time if they've built a trusted relationship. I'm mindful of time, so let me just land with the last few points. Sorry, Caleb. And that's kind of role of funding and policy. I think I've talked a little bit about that. I think where the voluntary sector can also come in is to become a critical friend. I think some of these organizations, Black-led organizations, working with this demographic intentionally, can be a critical friend. I mean, in some ways, you could call this conversation that we're having here, you know, some of the direct statements are saying, look, I want to be a critical friend. Because if you're looking to bring about change, there's no point doing the same thing and expecting something different. And the only shift really comes when we look at senior leadership and senior, I wouldn't even say management, I'll talk at director level, because I think there's a lot of people that may look like myself and others from the Black African, Caribbean, and Asian heritage that actually are in kind of middle management, but do they make the decisions at senior level? Unless we do that, but here's the big challenge for funding, funders, local authorities, organizations is that means someone has to give away power. And that's a big ask, because I think what we found with the George Floyd, we talked the language. And I know YEF has gone through this themselves, but they had to look at their website and had to look at who's at senior level, who makes the decisions. Unless that is representative of the very service users we want to reach, then we're just having a conversation. We're not actually changing anything. We can put as many policies as we want, but we're just having a conversation. So I think when we start looking at things like policy, funding, if we're really going to bring about a change, and that also means lived experience. It doesn't just mean necessarily, because you can have people, and I close with this, you can have people that may look like the service users you want to reach, but they've not lived in that world. And it's a complete different world. I'm talking now more about, we're talking about serious youth violence across the country. We're not talking about youth provision full stop. And I think it's quite clear there is a preventative model which will look at multiple needs and maybe universal needs. But when you're looking at the few that can create a lot of the challenges in our communities, you're looking at a number that can be quite targeted. So you can be quite intentional. And I think if you're willing to be targeted and you're willing to be intentional, you need people in the room that know what it's like to live in that world. And it is a different world. It's a subculture. They think different. It's not a code of honor. Sorry, it's not a code of law. It's a code of honor. What does that look like for you and me? It's completely different. Their respect and their credibility is way more important than the fact that they could get 5 years. So if you think like that, how do you then respond to disrespect? How do you respond to authority? And again, until we get a head around that, it's very hard for us to work in that space strategically, because more often than not, we're working from our worldview, not their worldview. And if you're going to take someone to where they've never been, you've got to start with where they're at, not where we're at. And I think that means radical change, and it means people in the room making decisions that can make some people feel a bit uncomfortable. You think, are we condoning this? No, we're on a journey with them, and we're trying to bring about change. But anyway, thank you very much. Hope that's brought some food for thought. And back to you, Caleb.
Superb, very deep, insightful, provoking, needed to be said out loud thoughts by both Adam and Des there. And I don't think I've ever seen a fire in the chat before at a YEF event. So there's a first. So take the badge, definitely take the badge. So at this point in time, the question I like to put into the room, and please put your questions in the chat because they have to be filtered before they come to us. So if you've got a question directed at Des or at Adam, please put in the chat. So when we come round, it will be much smoother. So as it pops into your head, please do that. We'll operate it on this side. But the key reason why we're talking about this is outside of those who have worked with children in this way, in this context, in your communities, who've been probably harping from the top of the hills about the reality of who's in the youth club and or in youth provision in that regard and how it affects them. We've got some really insightful information to share with you, which Chloe's is about to share. Chloe Lowry is our senior research manager. So hold what Des and Adam have said about, because very quickly it became structural, very quickly it became about acceleration of already existing organizations to climb, to be more strategic, to be in the rooms. It became less about tokenistic. If you want to reach these children, there are some brilliant individuals that if you line them up, we can do some of this work. But equally, if you aren't representative of those communities, be empowered to have some of this conversation through advocacy and some co-design to bring a community with you along the way, and it will go much further. But Chloe, let me introduce Chloe, who's going to come and talk to you about some very interesting insights that we found, which are important to share, which will make concrete what why this is so important. But Chloe's role is to translate research into actionable insights to help prevent young people from being drawn into violence. And Chloe brings a rich background in research, teaching, and developmental psychology to this work, to all work that she does here. And before joining YEF, Chloe co-led a series of policy analysis papers in the Journal of the Royal Society of Medicine, which explored the interplay between health and education outcomes and highlighted the need to prioritize children and adolescent mental health. Chloe has taught in secondary school in Croydon for 6 years and holds a master's in child development from UCL, where she conducted research into emotional regulation. Chloe is dedicated to using evidence-based approaches to improve outcomes for children and young people. So, Chloe, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Caleb, and thank you, Adam and Des. You're hard acts to follow, especially when I'm speaking from the research as opposed to your experience of all that kind of direct work with young people and your own lived experience as well. But I'm hopeful actually that the research can give us some insight as well, because ultimately it's conducted with young people. So all of the numbers that I'll talk about are numbers of actual individuals who've contributed their views and experience to the research that I'm going to talk about. Let me just pull up the slides that I've got. I'm hoping that's worked. Maybe Caleb, yeah, brilliant. You can see my slides. Fantastic. What I wanted to speak about today, and Caleb was hinting at this, is the research on open access youth work. Adam and Des both have that experience of working with children, young people who we know are at risk of violence or already involved in violence. But a lot of youth work, of course, is broader than that. It works with a whole range of young people, from those who have no involvement in violence to those who are already involved, and that takes place through youth clubs. And today I wanted to speak to you about what the research says on youth clubs, because there are some really interesting findings that relate to this question of how do you engage children from Black, Asian and other minority ethnic backgrounds in youth work. So today I wanted to kind of try and answer two questions that relate to this. The first is which children and young people are attending youth clubs? And the second is what impact do youth clubs have on children and young people's involvement in violence? And the reason that I'm asking these questions in particular and sharing it with you today is because there's actually been some very interesting new research that helps answer both of these questions. So that's why I thought it would be helpful to present that today. And it's research that I've found really interesting and have been focusing a lot on over the last few months. So on the first question, which is actually who are attending youth clubs, which children and young people attend youth clubs, until quite recently, we didn't really have a good understanding of that in terms of a kind of national survey or national estimate of which young people are actually involved in this type of activity and this type of youth provision. But last year we conducted a survey of 10,000 13 to 17-year-olds, which is something that we've done for the last few years, and it's called our Children, Violence and Vulnerability Survey. It's the largest survey in the UK of children's experience of violence, and the results of this survey are nationally representative. So the researchers took real pains to make sure they're hearing from a diverse range of young people in terms of age, gender, ethnicity and socioeconomic status that reflects the wider makeup of the country. And for the first time this year, we asked children about their attendance at youth clubs. And the question specifically asked whether they'd attended any of these types of youth clubs at least once in the last month. And if they said they'd attended at least once in the last month, we kind of considered that as kind of regular attendance. And we asked about different types of youth clubs because they can be quite diverse. So youth clubs in a youth or community centre, youth clubs in a school, youth clubs that are part of a religious organisation, online youth clubs, and then uniformed clubs like Boy Scouts or Girl Guides. Although when I talk about the statistics in the later sections, we've kind of added together the results for all of the youth clubs apart from uniformed groups, because we think there's some kind of key differences between that type of youth club or sort of youth provision, uniformed youth provision, where often there's kind of higher fees associated with it and subscription, as opposed to youth clubs which tend to be lower cost or free to residents in the area. And then we had also just this kind of any other type of youth club category to capture any variation that we didn't have in the previous categories. And the reason that I wanted to speak about this research today is because there were really big differences in ethnicity there are really big differences in attendance at youth clubs depending on children's ethnicity and their ethnic background. So what we found is that Black children are the most likely to attend some form of youth club. So if you look at that graph, you can see at the top 64% of Black children are regularly attending some type of youth club. Whereas if you look at the bottom, 36% of white children are regularly attending a sort of youth club. And this data is really striking. In research, we often get excited over kind of differences in percentage that might be like, oh, this is a 3% difference or a 5% difference, and oh, look at this difference, what does it mean? These differences are enormous. These are really significant findings and something that has really made us think about what role are youth clubs playing in engaging children from Black ethnic backgrounds, mixed backgrounds, other backgrounds and Asian backgrounds in youth work. What are they doing well? How are they succeeding actually in engaging this group of young people who sometimes can be seen as kind of more difficult to engage in other forms of programs. We also have a more detailed breakdown because, of course, when we talk about Black or mixed or other, these are just kind of very large categories. And you can see there the more detailed breakdown of children's detailed kind of ethnic background and the proportion of children from each of those backgrounds who are attending youth clubs. And I'll just give you a moment to look at that. I won't go through each one on that list, but I'll just keep that up there for a moment for you to see. And I think what we can take from this overall is, although despite the challenges that Adam was talking about, Des was talking about, and the need to do more, and for the youth sector to keep thinking about this, keep thinking, how do they engage children from minority ethnic backgrounds? How do they ensure leadership are reflecting the backgrounds of the children they're trying to serve? We can also say, actually, the sector is doing a good job, at least compared to some other sectors, of being a place where children from Black backgrounds, mixed backgrounds, Asian backgrounds feel like they want to be there, they want to be part of it. And that's a really interesting and encouraging finding for us. And when we look at the detail of it, we can get more into the detail and look at the different types of youth club, because as I said at the beginning, we asked children about different types of youth club and their involvement in different types of youth club. And you can see there are nuanced differences here as well, depending on how children's ethnic background. So for example, if you look at youth clubs at school, particularly high proportions of Black children are attending youth clubs at school. Also youth clubs that are part of religious organisations, particularly high proportions of Black children attend those. And then other areas, there's more of a mix. There's less kind of stark differences. But what we do see is kind of across this, there's a good proportion of children from all ethnic backgrounds who are attending these types of youth provision. They're doing a good job of engaging children, particularly children from minority ethnic backgrounds. I also wanted to talk about a couple of other findings from this survey, which just emphasise why we're thinking about youth clubs a bit more at Youth Endowment Fund. We have historically, we focus on, our kind of mission is to focus on those children who are at risk of violence and those children who are involved in violence already, and what support we can put in place for them. And one of the things that was really interesting finding from this survey was that these children who are at risk or involved in violence actually attend youth clubs in high.
Hi, Chloe, I believe you've gone on mute.
Ah, Sorry about that. Thanks, Janina. How much did you miss?
About 15 seconds.
Okay, let me go back to, let me see if I can go back, hopefully without putting myself on mute this time.
Yeah, it's come back.
Brilliant. So I was just talking about, we've got these different types of youth clubs, but overall, youth work, youth provision seems to do a good job of engaging young people from minority ethnic backgrounds. We also found in this survey something else very interesting that's making us think about youth clubs a bit more deeply. Historically, Youth Endowment Fund, well, our mission is focused on the children who are most vulnerable to violence or those already involved in violence. But the reason we're considering youth clubs a bit more deeply than we have in the past is that in this survey that we've been talking about, there were two other very interesting findings, which is that children who are directly affected by violence, so that's children who have perpetrated violence themselves in the last year and acknowledge that on our survey, or children who have been victims of violence in the last year and acknowledge that on our survey, are also much more likely to be attendants at youth clubs than children who don't. And also when we look at risk of involvement in violence, so children they're not involved at the moment, but there's some kind of vulnerability. So they might be children who describe themselves as being in a gang. They might be children who have a social worker. They might be children who've been excluded from school. Very high proportions of these children attend youth clubs on a regular basis. So even though youth clubs generally are this open access universal provision, what we're getting from this is they're also reaching a really vulnerable cohort of young people. And that's one of the reasons we're thinking about them more. I don't have answers to a lot of the questions. I'm sure a lot of you have questions coming out of this data. I have a lot of questions coming out of this data. We don't have all the answers at the moment, but we are looking to find out more. We're in the process of commissioning a review of youth clubs, and we're asking we're asking more questions, but kind of two key areas which we're exploring in this review of youth club is about actually what are youth clubs doing right to engage these children? Why are children who are vulnerable to violence or involved in violence, why is a youth club a space that they feel safe going to, that they're engaged in, that is meaningful to them? Equally, what children from Black backgrounds, children from Asian backgrounds, other minority ethnic backgrounds, what's appealing about a youth club? Why is that their source that they're going to and engaging there? And again, what can we learn from this? What can youth clubs be doing even better to engage these children and support them? So that's the answer to the first question, which children, young people are actually attending youth clubs. I just want to spend a few minutes on the second question, which is what impact do youth clubs have on children's involvement in violence? And with this question, similarly, we've got some new, really interesting research that I wanted to talk about. Why I thought it was an interesting question to explore today. This new research is conducted by Carmen Villa, who's a PhD student at the University of Warwick, and she set out to find out what impact did the closures of youth clubs in London since 2010 have on the children and young people in the local area in terms of their risk of getting involved in crime and getting involved in violence. And these funding cuts, this is due to the funding cuts that youth services across the country have seen, but she focused in on London as a particular area to conduct this research. And she's released several papers over the last year or so as she's kind of been doing this project. It's still a piece of research that's not yet completely finished. It's not yet been peer reviewed, so it's still a work in progress there. But what she's found through her research and in these kind of various drafts that have been released one after the other, is that when a local youth club closes, the children, young people who live in that immediate area around the youth club, their likelihood of getting involved in crime and violence increases. And you can see this diagram. This is taken from her paper. It's a map of London. You can see the triangles and the circles on it. Those represent youth clubs. The circles represent youth clubs that closed between 2010 and 2019. And the triangles represent youth clubs that remained open and were still open in 2019. So she's comparing children in the areas where the youth clubs remained open to children in areas where all of the youth clubs closed. And what's really what makes her paper a strong piece of research, that this sort of question is quite hard to research in a robust, really quantitative way, because you can't run experiments where you say, okay, well, I'll build a youth club here, but not a youth club there, and then 10 years later see what the results is. That would be a very expensive study to run. But she's kind of used this what gets called kind of natural variation in youth club closures from the funding cuts, and kind of exploited that natural variation to try and identify a causal impact of youth clubs. And what is quite convincing about her research design is that it seems to suggest that this was the impact of the youth clubs themselves and not the impact of wider austerity. So if we're looking at this period, say 2010 to 2019, a lot of services were being cut. A lot of funding was being cut. So that might affect education, that might affect policing, that might affect health services, therapy. But what's very interesting is she compared what happened with the young people in the area, and what happened with adults in the area. And adults' risk of being involved in crime did not increase when the youth club closed. It was only the age group who can actually attend youth clubs. So this is quite interesting, quite intriguing finding. Yeah, so essentially, if in terms of the kind of hard numbers, she found that young people living in areas where all of the youth clubs closed became 12% more likely to commit crime than children who lived in areas where there was still an open youth club. And she also found that they were around 9 to 10% more likely to commit a violent crime. That finding is more tentative. She didn't find that in every single kind of version of the paper that got released, because there are different ways of analysing the data. But this is really interesting research that has prompted us to think a bit more about youth clubs. And just as we're trying to understand this question of how are youth clubs engaging children, young people from Black and Asian and minority ethnic backgrounds more, we want to probe this more. We want to understand more about what impact youth clubs are having on children's involvement in crime and violence. And we're looking to see if we can extend and replicate this research. Because often, although it's great to have one study, generally in research, you can have one study and you can have another one, and they might see different things. So we try and get as kind of comprehensive a picture as possible before reaching a firm conclusion. But this is really interesting, and this is the only research of its kind that addresses this question. So to summarise, it's kind of left this is what these findings have left me with. Essentially, it's left me with some questions that I'm hoping to explore further, and that we'll be exploring further as Youth Endowment Fund. The first is this: are youth clubs particularly important in protecting Black, Asian and minority ethnic children from involvement in violence, given that such high numbers, high proportions of children from these backgrounds are attending youth clubs, and given that there's evidence that these youth clubs might be reducing involvement in crime and violence? Could youth clubs be playing a particularly important role for this group? Is that something we need to be thinking about? And then also, what can other sectors learn from youth clubs and the youth sector about engaging Black, Asian and minority ethnic children? Because although there are still challenges for the sector in ensuring that engagement and ensuring it's meaningful and ensuring it goes throughout the organisation, clearly there's something going on in youth work that is working for children from these communities, and often in other areas, maybe in health or in education, it's not working so well. So what can we learn from youth clubs and youth work in that regard? So those are the questions in my head from this research, but I believe we've got some time for questions now, and I'd love to hear what questions you have about this research. I might not be able to answer them. I'll do my best, but I'd love to hear even just what this makes you think of, what this makes you ask. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Chloe. So much there for us to think about, so much rich data, and really overlays and compresses some of our thoughts based on what Adam and Des were talking about. such an important feature. So it's over to you. We've had a few questions come in already, which is fantastic. So we'll kick off with those. And if you want to raise your hand to ask a question, please do so now. We'll do a round of questions and then go to the presenters and speakers to come back on. And the first question is from our colleague who is, sorry, I've got to find it. That's the thing about chat. From Jacob. Jacob talks about, what would you say are some of the key measurable indicators that you may have used to demonstrate reduction of risk of violence and crime? And maybe this is quite a generic one, but I'll probably specify a little bit. When intentionally or unintendedly thinking about children from Black, Asian, and minority ethnic backgrounds, and if it doesn't exist, what might it look like? So who wants to tackle that first? We'll hear from you both. Des, you kick off, and then Adam come in.
Yeah, just very quickly, I think like a lot of approaches, we underpin our casework stroke holistic mentoring with some theory. And I think one of the best theories that fit our engagement with young people, stroke young adults, to reduce serious youth violence is looking at 3 areas. And it's come from Alfred Adler's individual psychology, which specifically looks at inferiority complex with young people. Now, I don't necessarily believe in all of Alfred Adler's kind of theory base, but to cut a long story short, he looks at 3 areas: friends, family, and purpose. And the whole concept is, if a young person's friends is constructive and stable, their families, again, more supportive and stable, and they have a purpose, as in, again, a lot of young people don't really know where they're going to go in the future per se, but there's something that they want to achieve or go towards. If that's quite healthy, more often than not, you can help stabilize a young person in society that they can be fully functional. If one goes out, again, it's easier to focus. But when you think about a lot of young people, and I close on this, that are caught up in serious youth violence or violence affecting them, more often than not, there's issues around family dysfunctionality, friends dysfunctionality, and there's not really a clear purpose going on in their world. And I think from an approach regarding mentoring, stroke, casework, they're the 3 areas we look at. And it's underpinned by Alfred Adler's inferiority complex. So I would say that's the starting point, definitely.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Des. I have a thought, but Adam, let's come to you first.
Yeah, thanks, Des. That's really kind of handy to try and put that into some sort of model. Really, I'm not familiar with it, but I 100% agree on all of those things. I guess if I wanted to simplify that even more, I've always thought of it about something to lose. And quite often, if we're working with those who are most caught up and most likely to get caught up, quite often they're in a place where they simply don't care what happens to them because there's not enough to lose in their lives, or there's not enough that they necessarily respect about themselves that makes that incentive to not lose it. And I think what Des just said kind of perfectly encapsulates all of that. You know, having positive friends and trajectories. The family thing, God, that's really complex because it can be generational and just a cycle there. And I suppose in my mind, the answer to that question is kind of like pre-YEF and during YEF as well, because before we got involved in YEF, we were looking at, in our kind of theory of change, we were looking at things like trying to make someone a lower risk of school exclusion, because that used to be a turning point that we noticed in someone's journey towards criminality, getting involved in violent crime. However, when we came into YEF and set up our current study, I think there was definitely a certain amount of, well, what are we most likely to be able to evidence out of all of these different measures we could take? And now we've kind of ended up in a program where we've gone more towards the really recognized, verified measures of, you know, the well-being, self-reported delinquency scales, the Edinburgh Warwick scale for well-being, strengths and difficulties questionnaires. These are a lot of questionnaires which a lot of professionals doing casework and working in services will be familiar with. But that was largely because actually setting out to try and get other kinds of data seemed, you might get it, you might not, depending on which particular school or service was willing to share that with you. But yeah, definitely before our YEF study, we were looking at resilience and their ability to navigate difficult situations and make decisions that were good for them, whether friends that they had were in different types of friendship groups, as well as sort of the diversity of different sort of communities they were plugged into. I can't remember off the top of my head, but we got stuff around aspiration and whether they could actually see or envision a positive future for themselves. I guess in terms of some of the activities that we were bringing to the table, the aim there was that actually we could show that the work we were doing with them could lead to some other trajectories and pathways which they just couldn't imagine before as well. In answer to the question, there's a whole broad thing that feeds into it, but the trick is trying to figure out which ones you're most likely to be able to collect to demonstrate that impact.
And on top of that, there is the trickery tension between the outcomes that you see and go after versus the outcomes that potentially people who pay for the thing that you're doing might want or desire. And there's a real open dialogue to have about. I was part of a youth work evidence online, so one of the things that was spoken about was the soft outcomes is something that people who do a lot of this youth work facing work will say, listen, if you don't have the soft outcomes, you forget the hard outcomes. But actually they were saying about, shouldn't the soft outcomes be termed progressive outcomes, because you can't progress without them, and actually they're actually massively needed, going back to your point, Des, about family, friends, and something to aspire to in that regard. That's great. And thank you both for sharing that. The next question is about this is from Sarah, who talks about Spotlight, a creative youth space in Tower Hamlets, and resonates with a lot of the things shared, the youth arts leadership empowerment boards. The question she has was about, are there any innovative examples of changing traditional structural models? So an example that Sarah shared is a co-job share for director positions, where you have a young person in the role with a senior professional, which then brings, I imagine, brings balance, because the young person's viewpoint is as accounted for as the senior person, almost regardless of race, because if that young person is from the community that you're trying to reach, then that could potentially change it. Do you have any other examples that you thought? I mean, Adam, I'll come to you first. You're a bit about the young leaders. Tell us a bit more about that and what that's meant for you and how you've grown on that.
Yeah, I mean, like I say, it's meant that we are still relevant. That's really what it's come back down to, because I think we would be pretty irrelevant if we hadn't have brought it in. And that we still had the same practitioners that we did 12, 15 years ago. So I haven't seen firsthand an example like the one that Sarah put in the chat. What an amazing thing to make happen. But I think going back to what Des was saying is that a lot of these examples, they're going to rely on someone somewhere giving up some power. And I do feel like this needs to be a really conscious thing, but it doesn't necessarily even need to be all at once. And one of the things I left out of the bit I did about what needs to change, or what can funders and policymakers do to help. And I think that one of the things that I've come to understand recently is, if you want to build a team around lived experience, including young people in positions of power and decision making, or whatever the lived experience that your organization is working around, you can't just assume that lived experience is not going to show up every day in the way that people come to work and what they bring with them. You might have higher levels of staff absence because of trauma responses or mental health, or in the creative industries, a lot of us tend to be neurodiverse. That comes with its own strengths and frustrations around how people show up to work. And I do feel like if I was doing it all over again and I was like, right, I'm going to build a team around lived experience, including young people in paid positions of power, I think it's about, sorry to be boring, but just when you build up a budget for how your organization is going to run, you've got to assume that it's going to be X% more expensive to do it in this really lived experience way. And that could just be a thing that a lot of funders just recognise and assume that actually, if you're really diverse and you're not just going on the, and I say with inverted commas, the meritocracy that people are talking about as they withdraw from the DE&I strategies, then you're also going to need a bit more of a capacity to make that work, because you've got to assume that challenges will come with it, and that's okay. Because for us, our bottom line isn't profit, it's about impact, and you're going to get better impact if you are able to implement some of these things. So no, I haven't seen them firsthand. A lot of people are diversifying their boards. A lot of people are trying to bring more young people into trustee positions. I'd love to see something where a young person actually had a co-share of a powerful post. Really love to see how that could work.
Yeah, thank you, Adam. Des, any thoughts on this one?
Yeah, I think it's more looking at structures than it is necessarily a role within an organisation, but looking at a team evolving, developing, maturing, and addressing some of these issues. And especially if you're frontline workers and you want to enrich one's experience, I think having clinical supervision with somebody who's got lived experience, I think having that reflective space where we can, and again, it may need to be a young adult than a young person per se, and somebody who's got the wherefore to be able to sit in that space and have those conversations. Because I think sometimes there's questions that professionals have, this whole curious questions, or this curiosity that we need to have as professionals, that sometimes we don't ask those questions. We don't feel safe, comfortable. Where can we ask it? And often managers will know what's going on within the team and where the team needs to get to in their thinking, or even in their willingness to maybe adapt to certain issues that young people are facing. And I think it's more to do with an organizational change and shift in mindset. And I think, having somebody with lived experience to be part of a clinical supervision with a therapist managing that, and that person having a lot of, they've gone through it themselves, they're comfortable, you're not just putting somebody in there, but they've got something to say, and how the room manages what they're going to hear, and how the room manages what they're going to say as an organization, as a team, as a service provider, as a service delivery. Because the truth is, a lot of what we do because we think it works. And we hope it's going well. But sometimes, and I've learned this, and I close on this, it's easy to mark your own homework. Because what we do is great. Because we say it's great, and because we get funding. But there's a lot of privilege in that. There's a lot of opportunity we get. And when we start looking at research and what really does work, I mean, I've got my own views on research anyway, and I don't want to kind of rain on anyone's parade. But, the truth is, I think sometimes being in a space where it's evolving and developing, and finally on that, I think we come from a very Eurocentric point of view. We're talking about a people group whose first, maybe second generation, they don't come from that Eurocentric point of view. They go through a rites of passage point of view. They go through a community elders point of view. We go through numbers and stats and data point of view, and we say that's what works. But actually, with a lot of the people group we're talking about, it's about relationship. That's more to do, not transactional relationship, which I think is very Eurocentric. It's you do this, you get that. You do this, you get that. Whereas I think when you're looking at African, Caribbean, Asian communities, they don't operate like that in the same way. So I think we need to, and that's again, the way we think will be different to the way those communities think and their families may think, but yet we want to try and reach them. Just the thought.
Very, very provocative. As always, Des and Adam. This is good. Excellent. So the next thing that comes to mind and what colleagues are sharing, I've got some highlights, so do stick around. We'd love to share some developments with you in the last kind of few minutes, but probably from a colleague actually at YEF. What question is, what are, this is Luba, by the way, who's part of our youth understanding team, and what are your thoughts on how we can build more senior leaders from Black backgrounds in the youth sector? We are heavily present in the front line, but not in the mid to senior levels. And I probably, that's a lot to chew on. I'll give you some time to think about what can we get to get more competent, brilliant, relational, representative people that can lead. Who wants to kick us off? Adam, you're off mute, so you've invited yourself to give it a go.
Mentors, all the way through at every stage, and you know, because we're not talking about people who are not intelligent, are not quick learners. It's just seeing behind the curtain, and someone sort of say, okay, when you're at this stage, actually a good thing to be able to do is this, or maybe going into this meeting with that thing prepared, or have a think about what happens if that question comes up. I think it's just literally someone to kind of like make the learning real, rather than sort of just be, for me personally, if I was just sent a load of information about how to go on that journey, I wouldn't absorb it. So me personally, there's a few different things I could say, but for me personally, like having that elder, and for me personally, when we're talking about things like senior leadership and governance and those kind of skills that come around it, it wouldn't 100% have to be a person of color for me. However, when it has been, you also get all of the bonuses of them having been through that journey and some of the challenges that will have come up.
It's a really good challenge, Adam. I think that's a really nice base position and opinion on that. Yeah, Des, what's your thoughts on the question?
Yeah, I think if you're looking at from third sector to statutory, or we're just looking at the third sector generally, I think secondments. I think, you know, looking at some of these larger organizations, and then that can always be a little bit of a challenge, because if you remove people at kind of exec level or senior leadership level, can that charity, that organization still sustain itself? So there has to be some generous leadership there from whoever's offering that opportunity. But I think like a 3 months, a 6 month secondment, because I think there'll be a lot of transferable skills. Those organizations will gain a lot. You know, one thing I've realized in doing the work that I do, and I was speaking to somebody I won't name, but somebody who leads a large organization nationally, and we kind of have a mentoring exchange. Now I go to them to get from them, but what often I find, and they kind of mentioned it today, that they get a lot, because when you're thinking big and you're out there and you're thinking wide, sometimes you lose what's going on the ground. And that innovative, agile approach to certain things, you can't do that. It's a lot easier to turn a lifeboat than it is to turn, you know, a kind of a liner, a big ship, because it's hard to make those decisions. But you need to be thinking like that, depending if you're looking at departments. So I think there's a lot to be exchanged. But I think a secondment would be really good, and then that person goes back into their role. And the only reason I mentioned at the beginning, charity and kind of statutory services, because I think sometimes when we talk about funding, as we talked about earlier, and I know there's lots of different funding pipelines and streams, but if you're looking at kind of central government, Ministry of Justice, MOPAC, etc., they benefit, I think, from having people that are in the charity world being seconded into their world to help make decisions on how does this work really on the ground. Because that can be so far removed from the red tape that they just think, yeah, you put it out there and it will just flow down. No, it doesn't work like that. And so I think that would be helpful. Yeah.
Yeah. Super. Well, you held it all here first, I hope. Some great minds at play, thinking from the heart and from the mind with their experiences, which is super. You also heard about the evidence and where it's at right now. We're in a really good position that we can strengthen to better understand what happens in youth clubs and who is going to them, and why it's important. That it's not without saying how quickly we went very quickly back to the people, build them, and the children will come, which is what I'm hearing loud and clear, and multi-leveled, not just frontline in that regard. So a couple of developments before I say thank you to our guest. First of all, in the chat, you're going to get a feedback form, which we'd love to hear from you about the session. It's 2 questions. Do take a moment. If you are absolutely running out the door, please do it when the email comes around. You'll have similar information, but we'd love to hear from you about the content of this session. We want to continue to bring quality, and we push ourselves really hard on this. And so the only way you hear about that is when you hear from your audience, as said, and we'd love to hear from you. So in the chat, that will come up in a couple of seconds. Excellent, we love that. TC, brilliant, time worth spent, 100%. Hopefully we can not just hear stuff, but do stuff about it. That's the key thing. Also some bigger developments. As you're waiting for that to come through, I'm just going to put them in the chat very quickly. There is another VLC in February. That's the summer jobs one that talks about employability and reducing violence over the summer, which is based on evidence from America that we are trialing here in the UK. There is an open call fund at the moment, which you can click into. You've got the YEF toolkit. You've also got, in the winter, our youth sector practice guidance, which is a practice recommendation aimed for funders, commissioners, and delivery organization. That thinks about what works in youth sector to prevent violence. And then not so long after that, in spring 26, you have the youth sector system guidance, which will be spring 2026, which is system recommendations aimed at policy and senior leaders across the youth work system. And how can we work to make it easy to do what works? Because if you don't have the structural element, the practice element becomes really difficult, and the two have to come together. And that's how we'll do it. Chloe's beat me to the buzzer on the CVV report. I'll share it again in this little blunt, but there is a special report on positive activities and trusted adults. This is really great stuff. Sign up to the next VLC. Do not miss out. It'll be great to see you all again. A huge thank you to Adam, a huge thank you to Des, and a huge thank you to Chloe. And in the background, a huge thank you to Yanina, who has been co-piloting this one. All the very best from us at YEF until our next event. All the best, and please fill out the form when you get a moment. Take care and have a good afternoon. That's the stuff in the chat. Don't go without that. Cheers all.
Thanks. Bye.
Cheers, Adam. Thank you so much.
Cheers.
Cheers, Des. Thanks so much. All right.